Now this right here is meant to be my GT1010, but not just any GT1010. Nope, after the escapade from a couple of weeks ago, I wanted to get a hold of the most powerful version of it there was. Think of this a bit like being the GT1010 Ti, and after a lot of deliberation and conversations with a rather sketchy seller from China, I've managed to get a hold of one. So I managed to get a hold of this card somehow through the same eBay seller that sold me the first card, asking them if they had any more available, specifically the GDDR5 version. And they had one on sale from Shenzhen Bitland, which is apparently a real company and does make graphics cards, and there were some strange bits in there about how it's not for resale and it does not come in a consumer box. And then they also told me, after they listed it up for sale, that my card doesn't qualify for a warranty. Not that I ever expected one with a card that comes from China anyway. But what do you actually get with this card? Well, we got a lovely OEM box which says Lenovo, and that's about all I can read on the box, as that's all there is in English. The only bit that's English is Lenovo, and other than that, there's nothing really in here. It's not like the last one, which was clearly for consumers and was a branded Nvidia box. Nope, this is just a straight up brown box with Lenovo packaging and some foam and the graphics card inside. So even sketchier than the last one. And it also looks like the card has gotten a little bit beaten up during transit. Compared to our standard GT1010, there really are some glaring differences. Namely the big one: why does a modern graphics card for sale today, brand new, have a VGA port? Just a straight up native VGA port. Don't worry, we'll definitely be doing some testing on that later on in the video, as our last card came with an adapter that didn't really work at all. So maybe this is the real solution, just a straight up port from 20 years before this graphics card was designed. It also has a slightly chunkier cooler that's more or less the same, other than being slightly shorter, and that's more or less where the board design differences stop. So why don't we whack this in a PC and find out what's actually going on here? After whacking this thing in the main PC, it caused it to turn on and off about 3 times, but that's really not the strangest thing we've ever had happen when putting in a graphics card, and then it just booted up. And as unlikely as it seemed, given how sketchy this seller seems to be, they pulled through again, and this is for all reasons the most powerful GT1010 I've ever personally seen. It's got boosted GDDR5 memory, higher clocks, like ridiculously higher clocks, and an OEM manufacturer that I have never heard of, so if you've ever heard of Shenzhen Bitland or whatever their name was, make sure to actually let me know. Now, while we actually go ahead and get some new drivers on this machine, why don't we find out what are the full specifications on this weird GT1010 that got souped up for OEMs. History on these cards is very limited, as are the actual data on them, but it appears to have been released mere months after the consumer GT1010 and seems like an emergency response to the graphics card crisis, taking the weird and rare GT1010 and becoming an OEM option over in the East for them to whack into PCs during an era where you genuinely couldn't buy a graphics card. They come with a measly 256 CUDA cores, a strangled 64-bit memory bus, but it does come based on the very competent Pascal architecture, and features GDDR5 memory, which makes absolutely no sense, but these were strange times and apparently meant that they came with some very weird cards. And they aren't cheap either. There's no knowledge on what these actually cost in their regional markets, but this one with the cost of imports came to over $110. So that wipes the value factor off the table if you're anywhere outside China and Korea, where these things seem to have been sold. There's no real point doing a history part of this video, as in real terms what seems to have happened is Nvidia had the GT1030, we all know that card, sold off the defective units in certain countries as the GT1010, and these have somehow got scooped up by Shenzhen Bitland, whatever their name was, and they clocked them up to the 9s, gave them real memory, and then sold them to Lenovo, Dell, HP, and other more region local brands for use in low-end gaming PCs, and internet cafe machines. And to really put this into perspective, that this is the most powerful GT1010 that's ever released, I ran Time Spy from 3D Mark on the system just to see where things would place, and before we even did any overclocking, we topped the leaderboard, offering nearly double the performance of a standard GT1010, which is strange immediately from the get-go. So for all intents and purposes, this is the world's most powerful NVIDIA GeForce GT1010, and I'm getting really sick of saying 1010 already. Anyways, there's not really much point holding off anymore, because what we all wanted to see, and what we wanted to find out, was after how abysmal the last GT1010 we tested was, is this weird GT1010 Ti of sorts worthwhile? Surely it's got to be everything we ever dreamed of. Well, mostly it's just got to be better than the waste of silicon that is the base unit. Anyway, there's only one way we're ever going to find out, and that is in the benchmarks. Starting things off with Red Dead Redemption 2, which much like its base unit did need me to go through the settings config and change everything down to low, given that it only has 2GB of VRAM. Might be fast VRAM, but it's still only got 2 gigs of it. But after that, things weren't actually off to a bad start, where the game would now average double that of the base unit, and don't worry, we will have some proper comparisons in a little bit, but overall, it was a decent experience. I mean, it's not amazing, but this is the first time an entry-level NVIDIA graphics card has ever managed playable frame rates in a game this intensive, with it not actually looking too bad. So already we're off to an interesting experience, and one that I certainly wasn't expecting. Baldur's Gate 3 wasn't as much of a success though, with the game just about managing some playability. The game did run anywhere with 20 to 40 FPS most of the time, and it wasn't too bad. I could definitely play through the game like this if it was my only option, and especially compared to the slideshow of the base unit, this is a remarkable increase. It didn't look good, and we are still running with the lowest options in a very low resolution here, which is stretched widescreen, so it looks even worse. But a brand new title running on entry-level hardware, I have a degree of admiration for it, up until I remember the price. BeamNG started off fairly solid with our easy benchmark, running with 720p and low settings, and it did alright with good utilization, very little hitching, and a very smooth experience. But as we all know, this is one of the easiest situations for this card, and this game can get a lot more intensive than that. But even when I expected the worst by changing it to one of the more intensive maps with the same settings, well, we were still able to manage a very respectable 40ish FPS a lot of the time. Even very intensive scenarios like foliage and things like that loading in didn't really change the results at all. So for an entry-level card, we're actually seeing alright performance with an okay resolution. Sure, the settings are a little bit rough, but that's far better than their previous GT210 or 710 offerings could ever manage. GTA 5 was running here in full HD with high textures, normal settings, and of course soft shadows. And even then this caught me off guard, as we were now seeing anywhere from 60 through to 90 FPS throughout all of the single player game, generally averaging around the 78 FPS mark, sort of around that region, which is extraordinarily good for a low-end card, given that usually when we're in the realms of the 10 series, we're running the game with no shadows in 480p. And even intensive situations where things were just being strange in their normal GTA manner, well, they still strayed well above 60 FPS, which I really wasn't expecting. Over in the world of GTA Online, things were doing alright. Smaller lobbies ran very much the same as that of single player, with a similar average but never hitting the higher frames when things were quiet, mostly because utilization does drop. However, once you move over into a larger lobby, well, we were looking at an experience that now differed between 50 to 60 FPS. Not bad at all, nope, completely playable, and the drop wasn't as harsh as it can be on certain cards, and there was still a good chunk of pop-in that online exaggerated, but let's be honest, I'm looking for things wrong here, because for an entry-level card, we are managing GTA Online with over 16 players with not actually awful performance. So that's pretty respectable for a 10 series card. Usually I end up recommending smaller lobbies given they run better, but here, well, you can run the game fine with as many players as you'd like, and generally you'll still see around 60 FPS. Mountain Blade 2 Bannerlord eked its way into playability with double the frame rate of the base unit, now running with well over 80 FPS with the same settings used, and that's pretty decent. It was very smooth to play and there weren't all too many frame drops. However, more intensive settings could definitely hurt the card more than expected, but we do only have 2GB of VRAM, and even if it's speedy, that can sometimes be too little for modern effects. But throughout the in-game benchmark and our own large battle test, the game ran smooth enough with nothing in the way of hitching or slowdown, so overall a decent way to play, even if the resolution was low. Picking up the pace a little bit now with Skyrim, we went from a console-like experience before to now running at around 40 to 60 FPS depending on what was going on. This was with the low preset in 1080p, so it actually looked alright, and given that the anniversary doesn't seem to have a proper low preset, everything on it just sort of does look good, and it ran good and it looked good. There was no issues here with Skyrim. Fable The Lost Chapters went from managing just over 60 FPS with the high settings on the original card to now running at well over 300 FPS in certain places. This was with the game completely maxed out in 1080p. So for these older titles and classics, you genuinely don't have any worries. The game was able to manage a solid experience with hundreds of FPS, and that's with the game completely maxed out in full HD. So in those older titles, you could look at graphics mods, you could look at running them in 4K, and you'd still have plenty of headroom to go. New indie titles will still struggle though. Tavern Keeper could just about manage some playable frames, but this was with the lowest option selected in 720p, where the card simply can't handle modern graphical effects, despite it being a modern card. It really reminds you that as much as they souped up the GT1010, well, there's only so far that you can actually move something like this. The frame rate felt sporadic and floaty in places, with odd spikes there as well. Not actually too awful for an entry-level card, but given it was less pleasant to play than Red Dead 2 for example, maybe the GT1010 is limited before it even began. In a surprise revelation of sorts, Counter-Strike 2 actually runs really well though. With 720p and lower settings, which still look pretty good to be fair, we saw a very competitive frame rate, with it running at over 100 FPS a lot of the time during both actual gameplay and the benchmark itself. Smokes, flames, flashbangs and effects wouldn't cause all too much slowdown or hitching, and we actually have up-to-date drivers that support this game for once, and it kept stuttering to a minimal and unironically undetectable level for once. You could actually play Counter-Strike 2 on a card and have decently competitive frame times, which is absolutely unheard of on a low-end card, and does sort of put into perspective why these things are so popular in China and Korea, where they have internet cafes and things like that, and they'd want to play a competitive game like this, and they've now got a cheap option to do so. So there we have the benchmarks, and I did do even more, like Black Mesa, which is an older Source title but still fairly modern, and those run fine maxed out with well over 60 FPS in 1080p. So for a lot of older titles, you're talking 1080p with higher or ultra settings, and they look great and run great too, which is a surprise, because in the context of an entry-level card, this is what the GT1010 should be. But sadly, I doubt over here we will ever see them become commonplace. So I'm in two halves about this. For what is the lowest end card from Nvidia, a souped up version given better memory, this is extraordinarily good performance that I never thought we'd ever see from a 10 series card, offering double the performance of the normal unit. But these aren't sub £40, sub £30 cards like they used to be. Maybe in regions where they're slightly more common like China or Korea they might be, but I've got no way to verify that. And here in the West, well, even if you can find one, by the time you've got it imported, it is nearly a £100 graphics card. And that performance is abysmal for the money, there's no way around it. But just imagine if these things did actually get released properly to replace the GT210s that still exist and 710s, and they became the de facto sub £30 card they should be. Now that would be a great thing for those of us on the low end, but sadly they aren't. Talking about comparisons to the base unit though, I did compile a chart just to show how much they have managed to take the GT1010 and make it a little bit of a gaming powerhouse, as this really is the GT1010 Ti, because on average we saw over twice the performance with the same settings used, meaning if you wanted you could crank up some of those settings, or in some games like Red Dead Redemption 2 or Baldur's Gate 3, they go from being completely unplayable to the realms of playability, with an almost console-like experience, which I would never expected given how downright awful the original release was. I mean, I was appalled at just how terrible it was, and it makes sense why these things aren't for consumers, because over in the East, where these things likely do cost nothing, it would disrupt the market entirely, as why would you bother buying a used card or more expensive card when something this basic and this cheap can manage astonishingly well? But that does of course factor in that these things are cheap over there, because once again, no way to verify, so I am basing this entirely off speculation. But the performance for an entry-level graphics card here, it's unheard of. That in itself though made me wonder, just how much further can we go with things, as our original GT1010 couldn't really clock any higher than it came out of the box. So did these OEMs actually get themselves better chips as well? I mean, these were rejects from Nvidia, none of them were meant to be good. And after a little while overclocking, well, things speak for themselves entirely. We saw an increase of 275 MHz on core speed, which is a respectable boost given we didn't give it any more voltage, and over on memory we managed to achieve an increase of an extraordinarily high 750 MHz. And I was mostly doing this just to solidify my pointless world record for GT1010 overclocking, which was already at the top spot by just testing this thing by itself. But this allowed us to go even higher. In fact, the results were so astonishing that I ended up going back and redoing a few of the benchmarks just to see what the leap was in games, and performance was up nearly 20 to 30% in some titles just from boosting the clocks a little bit. Now, we were seeing well over double the performance of the standard release GT1010, and very rarely do I get excited about overclocking anymore, because let's be honest, most cards out of the box either boost themselves or are already clocked as high as they can be out of the box. But watching what is at the end of the day a glorified display adapter that has been modified by OEMs go this high, well, it was great to see what the results were like. Fortunately, it didn't mean this card was suddenly good, and I had to keep that in mind, because although this is great for an entry-level card, the moment it was faced with an actual challenge like the new Steel Nomad benchmark from 3D Mark, well, it wasn't great. I mean, I now hold the record for this as well, but the test ran at an average of 0.2 FPS. Frame times were genuinely so bad that there was legitimately a 5-second real-time gap between frames, which was possibly the worst performance I've ever seen, and did its bit just to humble me back and remind me that as interesting as this card is, you can whack good memory and high clocks on a turd, but at the end of the day, it is still a turd. But now for the real fascinating part, that weird VGA port. I dug out the AMD FX system that we were benchmarking last week and whacked in the PC, this graphics card. And that paired with a HP CRT, and after the complete failure of the retail GT1010's VGA adapter, I didn't have high hopes, and at first, the card seemed to do nothing. But after wiggling about a little bit and moving the port around, everything just seemed to work. The card found the monitor, and we suddenly had an exceptionally crisp and responsive analog output. I don't quite know how they've done this, because I would have assumed that they've built an active adapter into the card somehow, and that's how they've got the port on there. but the card offered us perfect scaling and more confusingly shows up in the Nvidia display panel as rendering on a VGA port. Which is weird, because most of the time when they've whacked, a display adapter, converter, whatever that is on there, it will say HDMI or DVI or DisplayPort, something like that. So this almost leads me to believe that some crazy OEMs in China are still making a brand new graphics card with native VGA support based on the still supported Pascal architecture. I have no idea if Nvidia knows this, I have no idea how many people do know about this, but this means this is the newest graphics card you can buy with analog output, which is insanity. Now, it could still take a little bit of tweaking in places to get it to run smoothly, as a lot of titles and programs still don't scale all too well to the smaller 4x3 resolutions. But in terms of a brand new card, it has a crystal clear VGA output and has access to all the latest Nvidia functionality. Doesn't have NVENC support, don't worry, I did test it. It doesn't matter what the OEMs did, that still doesn't work here. But it does work fine with a CRT. And it does have that high price, so it's weird because I'm conflicted, because it doesn't seem like it's just doing a pass-through to analog. It seems like they've actually built a real VGA display adapter into the card, meaning we're not dealing with active conversion and all of those weird things that go a little bit wrong, especially on CRTs. It's a bit of a revelation I wasn't expecting. And that meant that we were able to look at things through a slightly different perspective, as through the world of gaming, it means we can take that limited performance and generally have a brilliant experience, even if we are limited by the AMD FX processor in this PC that we're now testing with. Games like GTA 5 look stunning on the older technology. It can't be disputed with this game must have been designed with CRTs in mind, given it released on the Xbox 360. But we can now run it with ultra settings in 4x3 and take a look at just how well it runs and how good it looks on what is an entry-level display adapter. It really lends itself to this thing here because you've got a real depth to the picture and it doesn't feel like there's any latency, which is another point leading me to believe that this is a native signal. There's a chance it is just very good conversion, but given the response times were nearly instantaneous compared to that of the LCD we've just come from, I genuinely think they've pulled off an actual native analog port on a brand new graphics card. So it just gets weirder and weirder because you can take games and have them run fantastically on lower resolutions on a CRT with a brand new graphics card, almost like it was designed for this. The same can also extend over into games like BeamNG, where we can now whack things up to a mixture of medium and high settings, provided we run the game in 640x480, which is supported perfectly fine by the card and the game. So if you ignore the HUD taking up all that space, it looks unreasonably good. So maybe this is an area that these things are being used for back in their home region. I mean, quality analog output is something sorely missing from modern cards. So to take these modern cards, meaning you get a modern feature set, and you've still got the laggy control panel and things like that, because it does still lag here, you can whack up every additional feature you can find, and then run older titles like Unreal Gold with tons of enhancements on a modern PC running Windows 10, which is such a convoluted thing to be doing, made easy by this card, and it's almost like it's ideal for retro gaming. It just doesn't support any retro operating system. It's so close to having a purpose, but falls down at the final hurdle, which would be, say, Windows 7 support now. Maybe if you play competitive games and want no input delay, that's another advantage. I mean, Counter-Strike 2, as we saw, runs fine. So if you wanted to play this game natively on a CRT, you now can, which is an advantage to this card that maybe no one's thought of yet, or is possibly one of the reasons why they still sell it. I mean, CRTs are very popular over in Korea, I think, in internet cafes for competitive gaming, so maybe that's one of the reasons it's sold like this. One final point I wanted to touch on though was Crysis, which you may have noticed was omitted from the benchmarks as it has an issue that remains with the standard GT1010. The game will not start at all. but I figured out a way to make it launch. See, for some reason, and I can completely understand that Nvidia has neglected to fix bugs or issues in the drivers for these cards because no one's using them, but it does have an issue where Crysis doesn't launch. But if you run the game in DirectX 9 over VGA, it works. It won't start over HDMI, it won't start on different PCs or with different drivers. I've tried all those things, and I have no idea what kind of bug is preventing this. Trust me, I've tried the Steam release, the GOG release, the retail release. The only trick to getting it to run is this weird instance where you run it over VGA, and then it seems to run fine. I mean, as long as you're an 800x600 and running DirectX 9, it works. So the GT1010 can run Crysis with high settings. You just have to give it a very weird setup for it to even launch the game. So I'm glad this card continued to be weird till the very end. So there we have it, Nvidia's most powerful GT1010, and my thoughts remain similar to the last video. This is a great card that simply costs too much. I mean, if you had the normal GT1010 priced at say £25, and this one, the GT1010 Ti of sorts, priced at £35, well suddenly you have the low end of the market completely covered. This is the best low-end Nvidia card that they've made for years, and you can't even buy it. The seller even specified to me how this card wasn't for resale and it showed up in an OEM box. They did also tell me they have an RTX 4010, which could be a typo or could be another weird card that apparently they've managed to get a hold of and are now offering me. They want a good chunk of money for it, but if people are interested, I might try and get a hold of it. So at the end of the day, would I say to go out and get one of these weird GT1010 cards? Well, no, it's not worth it. In an ideal world, this would have replaced the GT210 and 710 and become a mainstream card, but it hasn't. Maybe if in the rare case you need a brand new modern card with a VGA output, but even then, try and find one. I had to message someone from China to try and get a hold of one of these. I hope you all enjoyed this look back on what has been the weirdest version of the weirdest card I've ever tested. Thank you very much for watching, and good night.